Detective Anthony Davis had been walking the beat for 15 long years. Every morning, he would put on that blue uniform with pride, believing he could make his neighborhood a safer place. He wasn't like the other cops who just counted down the days until retirement. Anthony actually cared about the people he served. His 8-year-old son Tyler was his whole world. Every evening after school, Tyler would wait by the window for his dad to come home. "Did you catch any bad guys today, Dad?" Tyler would ask with those bright, curious eyes. Anthony would ruffle his son's hair and tell him stories about helping lost tourists and returning stolen bikes to kids. He never told Tyler about the darker side of police work. Things started to change when Anthony got promoted to detective. He thought it would mean better cases, more chances to help people. But what he found in his new position shocked him to his core. Some of the officers he had looked up to for years were involved in things that would make criminals blush. It all started with a simple case. Mrs. Rodriguez from Oak Street called about break-ins happening in her neighborhood. 3 houses had been robbed in 2 weeks, and the thieves seemed to know exactly when families would be away. Anthony decided to dig deeper than usual. Something about these break-ins felt planned, too organized for random street crime. Following, the trail led him to an old warehouse on the south side of town. The building looked abandoned from the outside, but Anthony noticed fresh tire tracks and cigarette butts that hadn't been there long. His instincts told him to investigate further. What he found inside that warehouse would change his life forever. Hidden behind stacks of old furniture were boxes filled with cash. Not just a few $100s, but thick bundles of bills wrapped in rubber bands. Anthony's hands shook as he counted. There had to be over $200,000 just in the first box. But the money wasn't the worst part. Next to the cash were ledgers, detailed records written in neat handwriting. The ledgers told a story that made Anthony's stomach turn. They showed regular payments to police officers in his own department, officers he knew by name, men he had shared coffee with in the break room. The records went back years, showing how drug dealers were paying cops to look the other way during raids. Evidence was being destroyed. Witnesses were being intimidated. His own department was working for the criminals they were supposed to. Arrest Captain Williams, the man who had given Anthony his detective badge, was listed as receiving $5,000 every month. Sergeant Collins, who had trained Anthony when he was a rookie, was getting $3,000. Detective Murphy, who Anthony had considered a friend, was on the payroll for $2,000 monthly. The corruption went all the way to the top. Anthony spent 3 sleepless nights going through those ledgers. Every page revealed another betrayal, another officer he had trusted who was actually working for drug dealers. The worst part was seeing how they had been using their positions to hurt the very communities they were supposed to protect. Poor families were being targeted. Evidence in serious cases was disappearing. Real criminals were walking free while innocent people suffered. He knew he had to report what he found, but Anthony wasn't naive. He understood that corruption this deep meant he couldn't trust the normal channels. If Captain Williams was involved, then going to him would be like signing his own death warrant. Anthony decided to reach out to Internal Affairs, hoping they would be clean. Lieutenant Johnson from Internal Affairs agreed to meet Anthony at a small diner outside town. Anthony brought copies of the most damaging pages from the ledgers. Johnson looked through them with a concerned expression, promising to start an investigation immediately. For a brief moment, Anthony felt hopeful that justice would prevail. That hope didn't last long. 2 days after his meeting with Johnson, Anthony found his car window smashed and a note on his seat. "Mind your own business, or join your friend, Murphy, in the hospital." Anthony learned that Detective Murphy had been beaten so badly the night before that he was in intensive care. The message was clear. Anthony realized that Johnson had betrayed him, probably calling Captain Williams the moment their meeting ended. There was nowhere safe to turn within the department. The corruption was like a cancer that had spread everywhere. But Anthony wasn't ready to give up. He thought about Tyler asking him about catching bad guys. How could he look his son in the eye if he walked away from the biggest case of his career? The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday evening in February. Anthony was picking up Tyler from basketball practice at Lincoln Elementary School. Tyler was excited, bouncing in the back seat. as he told his dad about the three-pointer he had made during scrimmage. They were almost home when Anthony noticed the car following them. 4 unmarked police cars surrounded Anthony's vehicle in the school parking lot. He recognized the officers immediately. Captain Williams stepped out first, followed by Sergeant Collins and Detective Blake. These were men Anthony had worked alongside for years, men he had trusted with his life during dangerous situations. Anthony told Tyler to stay in the car no matter what happened. Through the rear window, he could see other parents and kids from the basketball team watching from inside the school. Tyler pressed his face against the glass, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Captain Williams approached Anthony's door with a calm expression that somehow made everything more terrifying. "Detective Davis," he said in that familiar voice Anthony had heard in 100 briefings. "I think we need to have a conversation." Anthony stepped out of his car slowly, his hands visible. He could feel Tyler's eyes on him from the back seat. "Captain, what's this about?" Anthony asked, though he already knew the answer. "You've been asking questions about things that don't concern you," Williams replied. "Looking into places you shouldn't be looking. Some people are concerned about your curiosity." Sergeant Collins stepped forward with a manila envelope. Inside were photos of Anthony at the warehouse, copies of the ledger pages he had shown to Johnson, and pictures of Tyler walking to school. The message was unmistakable. They knew everything he had discovered, and they knew how to hurt him where it mattered most. "Here's what's going to happen," Williams continued. "You're going to forget everything you think you found. You're going to stop asking questions, and you're going to continue being a good detective who focuses on regular cases. Do this and your son gets to grow up with his father." Anthony looked back at Tyler's frightened face in the car window. His son was holding his basketball, probably wondering why all these police cars had surrounded his dad. In that moment, Anthony had to make the hardest choice of his life. He could walk away, destroy the evidence, and let the corruption continue. Tyler would be safe, but how many other families would suffer because Anthony chose silence over justice? "I can't do that," Anthony said quietly. "I swore an oath to protect people, not to protect criminals who happen to wear badges." Williams nodded slowly as if he had expected this answer. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Detective Davis, for your son's sake." He signaled to the other officers. The last thing Anthony saw was Tyler's face pressed against the school window, tears streaming down his cheeks as his father fell to the cold pavement. 3 shots echoed through the parking lot on that February evening. Detective Anthony Davis died with his badge still pinned to his chest, and his son's screams piercing the night air. Within an hour, the official story was already being written. Detective Davis had been killed during an undercover operation gone wrong. The department would honor him as a hero who died serving his community. Captain Williams himself would speak at the funeral about losing a dedicated officer and friend, but 8-year-old Tyler Davis knew the truth. He had seen his father's killers wearing police uniforms, had watched them shake hands after the shooting. That night, as social workers tried to comfort him, Tyler made a silent promise to his father's memory. Someday, somehow, he would make sure these men paid for what the funeral was. Everything Tyler hated. Hundreds of police officers in their dress uniforms standing in perfect rows like toy soldiers. The same men who had killed his father were now carrying his coffin, pretending to be heartbroken. Captain Williams stood at the podium talking about Detective Anthony Davis like he was some kind of hero who died fighting criminals. Tyler sat in the front row, wearing a black suit that was too big for him. His Aunt Rebecca held his hand, but he barely felt it. All he could think about was that night in the parking lot. The sound of those 3 gunshots kept playing in his head like a broken record. Every time someone came up to tell him how sorry they were, Tyler wanted to scream the truth. But who would believe an 8-year-old kid over a police captain? Captain Williams even had the nerve to come over after the service. He knelt down in front of Tyler with fake tears in his eyes. "Your daddy was a brave man, son. He died protecting people like you." Tyler stared at Williams without saying a word. This was the same man who had given the signal for those other officers to pull their guns. Williams seemed uncomfortable under Tyler's stare and quickly walked away. The worst part came after the funeral. Tyler thought he would go live with Aunt Rebecca. She was his father's sister, and she loved Tyler like her own son. Rebecca had already started clearing out a room in her apartment, buying him new clothes and school supplies. For a few days, Tyler thought maybe things would be okay. Rebecca understood his pain because she was grieving too. But then the social worker showed up. They said there were concerns about Rebecca's ability to care for Tyler. Apparently, she had some old parking tickets that hadn't been paid. Her apartment was too small. Her job as a waitress didn't pay enough. Tyler listened to them list excuse after excuse, knowing this wasn't really about Rebecca's qualifications. The first foster home was with the Johnson family. Mr. Johnson was a mechanic who barely looked up from his newspaper when Tyler arrived. Mrs. Johnson seemed nice enough, but she already had 3 other foster kids and didn't have much time for a traumatized 8-year-old. Tyler spent most of his time in a small bedroom he shared with 2 other boys, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his dad. Every few weeks, Rebecca would visit. She would bring Tyler his favorite cookies and update him on her fight to get custody. "I'm working with a lawyer now," she would whisper during their supervised visits. "We're going to get you out of here soon." But somehow, every time Rebecca got close to winning custody, something would go wrong. New paperwork would appear claiming she had missed court dates she was never told about. Witnesses who were supposed to support her case would suddenly change their minds. Tyler started to realize that invisible hands were working against Rebecca. The same people who killed his father were making sure Tyler stayed trapped in the system. They couldn't risk him living with someone who might believe his story about what really happened that night. The second foster home was worse. The Peterson family seemed perfect on paper. Mr. Peterson was a retired teacher and Mrs. Peterson volunteered at church. But behind closed doors, they were only interested in the monthly check they received for taking care of Tyler. He was fed the bare minimum and spent most evenings locked in his room, while the Petersons watched television downstairs. Tyler learned to keep quiet about everything. When social workers asked how he was doing, he would just nod and say, "Fine." He had figured out that complaining only made things worse. The system didn't want to hear about his problems. They just wanted him to disappear quietly until he turned 18. It was during his time with the Petersons that Tyler discovered something strange. Every month, someone was leaving extra money for his care. The Petersons never mentioned it, but Tyler overheard Mrs. Peterson talking on the phone about anonymous donations that helped cover his expenses. The money came with notes that the Petersons would throw away, but Tyler managed to fish one out of the trash. "Your father was a good man. Don't give up hope. Someone remembers the truth." The handwriting was neat and careful, like a woman's writing. Tyler kept that note hidden under his mattress, reading it whenever he felt completely alone. Someone out there knew what really happened to his father. Someone was trying to help him, even if they had to stay hidden. Tyler's third foster home was with an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen. She was different from the others. She didn't ask many questions, but she made sure Tyler had everything he needed. More importantly, she let him spend hours at the public library after school. Tyler became obsessed with reading everything he could find about police work, criminal, justice, and corruption cases. Mrs. Chen would pick him up from the library every evening without complaining about how long he stayed. Sometimes she would bring him hot chocolate and sit quietly while he read. She never pushed him to talk about his feelings or his father, but Tyler could tell she understood his pain in a way the other foster parents didn't. One evening, when Tyler was 12, Mrs. Chen sat down next to him at the library. "You're looking for something," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Tyler looked up from the newspaper archives he was reading. He had been going through old articles about police corruption cases, trying to understand how these things worked. "My dad was murdered," Tyler said. It was the first time he had spoken those words out loud to anyone. Mrs. Chen nodded like she already knew. "The men who killed him are still free. They're still wearing badges and pretending to be heroes." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small key. "When you turn 18, go to First National Bank on Maple Street, box 247. This key will open it." She pressed the key into Tyler's hand. "Your father left something for you. Something Important? Tyler stared at the key. How do you know about my father? Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. Because I worked with him. I was Lieutenant Chen, Internal Affairs. I was the one who was supposed to help him when he found that evidence. She took a shaky breath. I failed him. I failed you. But maybe it's not too late to make things right. That night, Mrs. Chen told Tyler everything. How his father had come to her with evidence of corruption. How she had promised to help, but was too scared when Captain Williams threatened her family. How she had been forced to disappear after Tyler's father was killed because she knew too much. She had been watching over Tyler from a distance, making sure he was safe, waiting for the right time to give him the tools he would need for justice. The anonymous money had been coming from her. She had been working odd jobs and saving every penny to help Tyler survive the system. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, she told him. He chose to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. Someday, you'll have to make the same choice. For the next 6 years, Mrs. Chen became more than just a foster parent. She became Tyler's teacher, preparing him for the fight ahead. She taught him how to research, how to gather evidence, how to think like a detective. She helped him understand that anger alone wouldn't be enough. He would need patience, intelligence, and a plan. Tyler threw himself into his studies with an intensity that worried his teachers. He memorized faces, license plate numbers, and details about every conversation he overheard. His bedroom walls were covered with newspaper clippings about corruption cases from around the country. He was building a mental database, though he wasn't sure yet how he would use it. When Tyler turned 16, he made a discovery that changed everything. He was researching a school project about local history when he found old newspaper articles about his father's death. The official story didn't match what he remembered from that night. The timeline was wrong. Key witnesses had given statements that contradicted each other. Evidence had mysteriously disappeared from the police files. This was the moment Tyler realized his father's death wasn't just murder. It was a cover-up involving multiple people, all working together to hide the truth. His father hadn't just stumbled onto some small-time corruption. He had discovered something big enough that powerful people were willing to kill to protect it. On his 18th birthday, Tyler walked into First National Bank with Mrs. Chen's key. Inside the safety deposit box, he found copies of his father's original evidence, witness statements that had never been filed, and a letter written in his father's handwriting. The letter was dated the day before his father, Tyler Davis, disappeared the day after his 18th birthday. That's what everyone thought anyway. In reality, he had legally changed his name to David Morgan and moved 3,000 miles away to California. He had spent months planning this transformation, choosing a name that sounded ordinary and forgettable. David Morgan could be anyone. Tyler Davis was a target. The letter from his father had explained everything. Detective Anthony Davis had discovered that the corruption went far beyond a few dirty cops taking drug money. There were connections to organized crime families, evidence tampering in major cases, and a network that reached into the court system itself. His father had known he was in danger, but he had also known that someday Tyler would need the truth to get justice. David enrolled at Riverside Community College in Southern California. He chose criminal justice as his major, telling professors he wanted to become a police officer to honor his father's memory. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. David wasn't planning to become just any cop. He was planning to become the kind of law enforcement officer who could take down entire criminal organizations. College was different from anything David had experienced. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't living in fear or anger every single day. He could focus on learning, on building the skills he would need for his mission. His professors noticed his intense dedication to studying police procedures, criminal law, and evidence collection. David had a photographic memory for details and an almost obsessive interest in corruption cases. During his second year at community college, David got a part-time job working for a private investigation firm called Pacific Security Solutions. The owner, an ex-cop named Rodriguez, hired David to do basic computer work and file organization. But David was eager to learn everything about the investigation business. He stayed late every night reading case files and teaching himself advanced research techniques. Rodriguez noticed David's enthusiasm and started giving him more interesting assignments. "Most kids your age just want easy money," Rodriguez told him one evening as they worked on an insurance fraud case. "But you actually care about finding the truth. That's rare." David learned how to conduct surveillance, how to interview witnesses without them knowing they were being interviewed, and how to find information that people thought they had hidden forever. After 2 years at community college, David transferred to UCLA. His grades were perfect, and his application essay about wanting to fight corruption in law enforcement impressed the admissions committee. David knew that having a degree from a prestigious university would be crucial for his long-term plans. He needed credentials that would open doors at the highest levels of law enforcement. At UCLA, David double-majored in criminology and computer science. The criminology courses taught him how criminal organizations operated, how they laundered money, and how they corrupted legitimate institutions. The computer science classes gave him skills in digital forensics and data analysis. David was building a toolkit that would let him hunt criminals in both the physical and digital worlds. His professors thought David was just an unusually motivated student. He never talked about his personal reasons for studying law enforcement. Instead, he wrote papers about abstract concepts like the psychology of institutional corruption and technological approaches to evidence preservation. David learned to discuss his father's case as if it was just academic research rather than a personal mission for revenge. During his junior year, David made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He applied to join the FBI. His professors had expected him to go to law school or maybe join a local police department. But David had bigger plans. The FBI had jurisdiction over public corruption cases. They had the resources and authority to take down networks that local police couldn't touch. The FBI application process was grueling. Background investigators interviewed everyone David had ever known, from his community college professors to his old foster families. David had prepared for this moment carefully. His new identity was clean, his academic record was flawless, and his stated motivation for joining law enforcement seemed genuine. The investigators found exactly what David wanted them to find: a young man inspired by his father's heroic death to dedicate his life to fighting crime. FBI training at Quantico was the hardest thing David had ever done. The physical training pushed his body to its limits. The academic coursework covered everything from constitutional law to advanced firearms training. But the most valuable part was learning how federal investigations actually worked. David studied how agents built cases against organized crime families, how they used financial records to prove corruption, and how they protected witnesses who testified against dangerous criminals. David specialized in white-collar crime and public corruption during his training. His instructors were impressed by his natural understanding of how criminal organizations operated. They didn't know that David had been studying these subjects for over a decade, preparing for this exact moment. To them, he was just a talented rookie with good instincts. Agent David Morgan graduated at the top of his class from the FBI Academy. His first assignment was to the Denver field office, where he worked on bank fraud and embezzlement cases. David knew this was just the beginning. He needed to build a reputation as a brilliant investigator before he could request a transfer to Chicago. Every case he worked was practice for the big one he was really planning. For 5 years, David built his career methodically. He solved complex financial crimes that other agents couldn't crack. He developed a network of contacts in law enforcement agencies across the country. His supervisors wrote glowing performance reviews, praising his dedication and his innovative investigative techniques. David was becoming exactly what he had planned to become: an FBI agent with the skills and credibility to take on any corruption case. But David never forgot why he was really doing all of this. Every night before bed, he would look at the photo of his father that he kept hidden in his wallet. Sometimes he would reread the letter his father had written, reminding himself of the promises he had made. Captain Williams was still out there, still wearing a badge, still getting away with murder. Every day that passed was another day of injustice. In 2013, David read a news article that changed everything. Captain Williams had been promoted to Chief of Police in Chicago. The man who had ordered his father's execution was now running the entire police department. David's first reaction was rage, but then he realized this was actually an opportunity. The higher Williams climbed, the more public his downfall would be when David finally brought him down. David spent the next 2 years preparing for his return to Chicago. He used his FBI access to research every case Williams had been involved in over the past 18 years. He mapped out the current structure of the corrupt network, identifying which officers were still active and which ones had retired or died. He also started reaching out to honest cops in the Chicago Police Department, building relationships that would be crucial when the time came to move. The breakthrough came when David discovered that Detective Murphy, one of the men who had been present at his father's murder, was now working as a security consultant. Murphy had been forced out of the police department after a series of administrative errors. But David's research revealed that he was actually suffering from severe alcoholism and financial problems. This made him a potential target for recruitment. David also learned that Williams's corruption network had evolved far beyond what his father had originally discovered. They were now involved in evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and contract killings. The organization was generating millions of dollars annually through protection rackets and had connections to 3 major crime families. Williams had used his 20 years of freedom to build a criminal empire that operated under the cover of law enforcement. By 2015, David had assembled a case file that contained 20 years of evidence against Williams and his associates. He had financial records, witness testimonies, surveillance photos, and digital evidence that proved the scope of the corruption. More importantly, he had identified 3 completely honest officers within the Chicago Police Department who could serve as allies when the time came to make arrests. David's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would request a transfer to the FBI's Chicago field office, citing his expertise in public corruption cases. Once he was back in his hometown, he would begin building a federal case against Williams's network. But this wouldn't be just any corruption investigation. David was planning to expose 20 years of crimes, including the murder of Detective Anthony Davis. The night before David submitted his transfer request, he sat in his Denver apartment and wrote a letter to his father. He told him about everything he had learned, everything he had accomplished, and everything he was planning to do. "I know you can't read this," David wrote, "but I want you to know that your son didn't forget. I didn't give up, and I'm coming home to finish what you started." David sealed the letter in an envelope and put it with his father's original evidence. Soon, he would be back in Chicago for the first time since that terrible night in the school parking lot. But this time he wouldn't be a helpless 8-year-old boy watching his father die. This time, he would be Special Agent David Morgan, armed with the law and 20 years of preparation. The men who had destroyed his family were about to learn that some debts could never be forgotten, and justice, even when delayed, always finds a way. Agent David Morgan stepped off the plane at O'Hare Airport on a cold October morning in 2015. 20 years had passed since he left Chicago as Tyler Davis, a broken 8-year-old boy with nowhere to go. Now he was returning as a federal agent with one mission: to bring down the men who killed his father. The city looked the same, but everything felt different. This time, he had the power to fight back. David's transfer to the FBI's Chicago field office had been approved without any questions. His supervisor in Denver had recommended him highly, describing him as one of the best corruption investigators in the Bureau. David's new colleagues in Chicago welcomed him warmly, impressed by his track record of solving complex financial crimes. None of them suspected that their new teammate had a personal connection to the city's biggest corruption problem. The first person David needed to find was Mrs. Chen, the former Internal Affairs lieutenant, who had helped him survive the foster care system. She was living in a quiet suburb under a different name, still afraid that Williams might come after her if he discovered she was alive. When David knocked on her door, she almost didn't recognize him. The skinny, angry teenager had grown into a confident man in a federal agent's suit. Tyler? She whispered, looking around nervously before letting him inside. David smiled and shook his head. It's David now. David Morgan, FBI. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears as she realized what this meant. The boy she had helped raise was now in a position to finally get justice for his father. Their reunion was emotional, but it was also a strategy session. Mrs. Chen told David how much the corruption had spread since his father's death. Williams's network now included not just police officers, but also judges, prosecutors, and city officials. They had gotten bolder over the years, believing they were untouchable. They think they won, Mrs. Chen said bitterly. They think everyone who could threaten them is either dead or too scared to talk. David spent his first month in Chicago, carefully observing the police department from the outside. He attended community meetings, read local news reports, and studied crime statistics. What he found confirmed Mrs. Chen's warnings. Certain types of cases never seemed to get solved. Evidence had a habit of disappearing. Witnesses would suddenly change their stories or refuse to cooperate. The corruption had become a machine that protected itself automatically. The breakthrough came when David identified two honest officers who were being systematically marginalized by the corrupt system. Detective Sofia Martinez had been passed over for promotion 7 times despite having the highest case clearance rate in her precinct. Sergeant Kevin Washington had been transferred to a desk job after asking too many questions about missing evidence. Both officers had spotless records and reputations for integrity. David approached Detective Martinez first. He arranged to meet her at a coffee shop near the courthouse, introducing himself as a federal agent working on organized crime cases. "I've been reading about some unusual patterns in evidence handling," David said carefully. "Cases where key evidence disappears or gets mislabeled. I'm wondering if you've noticed anything similar." Martinez studied David's face for a long moment. She had learned to be suspicious of anyone asking questions about department procedures. But something about this federal agent seemed different. He wasn't trying to intimidate her or rush her into saying something she might regret. "Are you wearing a wire?" she asked bluntly. David smiled and opened his jacket, showing that he had no recording equipment. "I'm not here to trap anyone, Detective Martinez. I'm here because I think there are people in your department who are breaking federal laws, and I think you might be one of the few officers honest enough to help me prove it." Over the next several weeks, David slowly built trust with both Martinez and Washington. He never pushed them for information, never asked them to do anything that might put them in danger. Instead, he shared his expertise about corruption investigations, helping them understand what signs to look for and how federal cases were built. Both officers began to realize that this FBI agent might be their only chance to fight back against the system that had been holding them down. The real breakthrough came when David decided to approach Detective Murphy, one of the men who had been present at his father's murder. Murphy was now working as a private security consultant, but David's research had revealed that he was struggling with alcoholism and mounting debts. More importantly, Murphy seemed to be haunted by guilt about his past actions. David found Murphy at a bar near the old police station, drinking alone on a Tuesday afternoon. Murphy looked older than his 53 years, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. David sat down next to him and ordered a beer, making casual conversation about sports and the weather. It took 3 meetings before David revealed that he was an FBI agent investigating gang connections to police corruption. "I'm not looking to destroy good cops," David told Murphy during their 4th meeting. "I'm looking for people who got caught up in something bigger than they expected and maybe want a chance to make it right." Murphy's hands were shaking as he lifted his drink. He had been waiting 20 years for someone to offer him a way out of the nightmare his life had become. Murphy's cooperation opened up the entire case for David. Through Murphy's testimony, David learned that the original corruption had started small in the 1990s, but had grown into a massive criminal enterprise. Williams's network was now providing protection for drug trafficking, human trafficking, and money laundering operations. They were connected to the Romano crime family and had judges on their payroll who would dismiss cases or reduce sentences for connected criminals. But the most shocking revelation was about his father's murder. Murphy told David that Detective Anthony Davis hadn't just discovered drug money corruption. He had uncovered evidence that Williams was providing police protection for a human trafficking ring that targeted runaway teenagers. The victims were mostly kids from poor families, who wouldn't be missed, and the operation was generating millions of dollars for both the crime families and the corrupt cops. "Your father," Murphy said, not knowing he was talking to Tyler Davis. He found records showing that missing kids from foster care were being sold to traffickers. Williams couldn't let that information get out because it would have brought federal attention to everything. Killing one honest cop was easier than shutting down a billion-dollar operation. David had to excuse himself to the bathroom to compose himself after hearing this. His father hadn't just died fighting drug corruption. He had died trying to save children who were being treated as merchandise by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The scope of the crimes was bigger and more evil than David had ever imagined. As David's investigation deepened, Williams began to suspect that someone was getting close to his operation. Several key witnesses suddenly died in what appeared to be accidents or suicides. Murphy came to David in a panic, saying he thought he was being followed. Detective Martinez reported that someone had broken into her apartment, though nothing was stolen. The corrupt network was trying to eliminate potential threats before they could testify. David realized he was running out of time. Williams was preparing to disappear, probably taking millions in stolen money to a country without extradition treaties. Several corrupt officers had already taken early retirement and left the state. The criminal organization that had taken 20 years to build was being dismantled by its own leaders to avoid prosecution. Working 18-hour days, David assembled the most comprehensive corruption case in FBI history. He had financial records proving that Williams had received over $2 million in bribes over 20 years. He had witness testimony from Murphy and 3 other former officers who had agreed to cooperate. He had surveillance footage showing current officers meeting with known crime family members. Most importantly, he had evidence connecting Williams to at least 12 murders, including the death of Detective Anthony Davis. The case was so complex that David needed approval from the highest levels of the Justice Department. When he presented his evidence to the U.S. Attorney for Northern Illinois, the prosecutor's first reaction was disbelief. "This isn't just corruption," the attorney said, looking through David's files. "This is a criminal organization that has been operating under the cover of law enforcement for 2 decades. David knew that bringing down Williams's network would require a coordinated operation involving multiple federal agencies. They would need to arrest dozens of people simultaneously to prevent evidence from being destroyed or witnesses from being killed. The operation would be the largest police corruption bust in Chicago's history, and David would be the agent in charge of making sure justice was finally served. As David prepared for the final phase of his investigation, he visited his father's grave for the first time since returning to Chicago. Standing at the headstone, he whispered, "I found them, Dad. I found all of them. And tomorrow the whole world is going to know what they did to you." The morning of March 15, 2017, started before sunrise for David Morgan. This was the day he had been planning for over 20 years. At 4 a.m., FBI agents across Chicago were getting their final briefings for Operation Clean House, the largest police corruption raid in the city's history. David stood in front of a room full of federal agents, holding a thick folder containing evidence that would destroy Chief Williams's criminal empire. "Today we're not just arresting corrupt cops," David told his team. "We're dismantling a criminal organization that has been terrorizing this city for decades. Some of these people have committed murder. Others have helped traffickers sell children like merchandise. They've hidden behind badges while destroying lives." The room was silent as agents studied their target lists. 37 people would be arrested simultaneously across the city. David had spent the previous week making sure every detail was perfect. Search warrants had been signed by federal judges who weren't connected to Williams's network. Evidence teams were ready to secure financial records, computer files, and physical evidence from over 20 locations. Witness protection arrangements had been made for Murphy and the other cooperating officers. Nothing could be left to chance. The first target was Chief Williams' house in an expensive suburb. David had personally requested to lead this arrest. As their convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the mansion, David felt his heart pounding. This was the man who had ordered his father's murder, who had destroyed his childhood, who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable. Today, that all came to an end. Williams answered the door in his bathrobe, clearly expecting this was just another routine police matter. When he saw the FBI badges and arrest warrants, his face went completely white. There must be some mistake, he stammered, but David was already reading him his rights. Williams's hands were shaking as David placed the handcuffs on his wrists. The same hands that had given the signal for those officers to kill Anthony Davis 22 years ago. While other agents searched Williams's house, David sat across from him in the back of an FBI van. Williams kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that he was a respected police chief who had served the city faithfully for decades. David let him talk, watching the man who had haunted his nightmares for over half his life. Williams looked older and smaller than David remembered. Without his police uniform and the power it represented, he was just a frightened old man. "We found the offshore accounts," David said quietly. Williams stopped talking mid-sentence. "We found the safety deposit boxes. We found the records of payments from the Romano family. We found everything, Chief Williams." Williams' lawyer instincts kicked in and he demanded to speak to his attorney. But David wasn't finished yet. "We also found the evidence about Detective Anthony Davis," David continued. Williams' eyes widened slightly at the mention of that name. "You remember Detective Davis, don't you? The honest cop who discovered your trafficking operation? The one you had murdered in front of his 8-year-old son?" Williams stared at David with growing suspicion. "Who are you?" he whispered. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's old badge, the one that had been returned to the family after the funeral. "I'm Tyler Davis," he said. "I'm Detective Anthony Davis's son, and I've spent the last 22 years preparing to bring you down." The shock on Williams's face was everything David had imagined it would be. Williams's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. He couldn't believe that the helpless little boy he had orphaned had grown up to become the federal agent destroying his life. "That's impossible," Williams gasped. "You're dead. I was told you died in foster care." David smiled coldly. "You were told wrong. I survived. I grew up. I became everything my father wanted me to be. And now, I'm here to finish what he started." Williams slumped back in his seat, finally understanding that his 20-year reign of corruption was over. The boy he had underestimated had become the man who would destroy him. Across the city, the coordinated raids were going perfectly. Detective Murphy had been arrested at his apartment, but he was already cooperating and would receive a reduced sentence for his testimony. Sergeant Collins was found trying to destroy financial records when agents broke down his door. Judge Richardson, who had been taking bribes to dismiss cases, was arrested at the courthouse in front of dozens of witnesses. The most satisfying arrest was Detective Blake, one of the men who had actually pulled the trigger on David's father. Blake was now 58 years old and working as a security guard at a shopping mall. When FBI agents surrounded him during his lunch break, Blake immediately knew what this was about. He had been expecting this day for 20 years, wondering when someone would finally connect him to Detective Davis's murder. By noon, all 37 targets were in federal custody. The evidence teams had seized over $15 million in cash, gold, and property purchased with bribe money. Computer forensics experts were analyzing hard drives that contained records of the trafficking operation, showing how hundreds of runaway children had been sold to criminals over the past 2 decades. The scope of the crimes was even worse than David had imagined. The news media went crazy when the arrests were announced. Channel 7 interrupted regular programming to report that Chicago's police chief and dozens of other officers had been arrested on federal corruption charges. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising that the city would cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Citizens who had suffered under the corrupt system for decades finally felt like justice was possible. Williams's trial became the biggest news story in Chicago for months. The evidence was overwhelming, but David wanted to make sure the public understood exactly what these men had done. During his testimony, David revealed his true identity for the first time. The courtroom gasped when he explained how he had spent over 20 years preparing to bring his father's killers to justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David said during his victim impact statement, "my father died because he refused to let criminals abuse children. He died because he believed that police officers should protect the innocent, not profit from their suffering. These men didn't just commit crimes. They betrayed every decent cop who ever wore a badge." Murphy's testimony was devastating for the defense. He described in detail how Williams had ordered the murder of Detective Anthony Davis, how they had covered it up, and how the corruption had grown over the following years. Murphy had been carrying the guilt of that night for 22 years, and his relief at finally telling the truth was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Williams was found guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, murder, human trafficking, money laundering, and civil rights violations. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Williams was led away in shackles, he looked back at David one last time. David didn't feel satisfaction or revenge. He felt peace. Detective Blake received 40 years for his role in the murder and trafficking operation. Sergeant Collins got 35 years. Judge Richardson was sentenced to 25 years and permanently disbarred. In total, 29 people received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. The remaining 8 defendants received plea deals in exchange for their cooperation in ongoing investigations. The changes in Chicago were immediate and dramatic. Detective Martinez was promoted to captain and put in charge of a new anti-corruption unit. Sergeant Washington became the head of internal affairs, with a mandate to rebuild trust between the police and the community. Federal monitors were assigned to oversee the police department for the next 10 years, ensuring that this kind of systematic corruption could never happen again. 6 months after the trials ended, David visited his father's grave. Mrs. Chen came with him, along with Detective Martinez and Sergeant Washington. They had all become friends during the investigation, united by their commitment to honor Anthony Davis's memory. David placed his FBI badge on the headstone, just as he had promised himself he would do years ago. "We did it, Dad," David whispered. "We got them all. Every single one of them." A memorial garden was later built near the police station, honoring Detective Anthony Davis and other officers who had died fighting corruption. David's father's name was engraved in black marble with the inscription, "He died protecting those who couldn't protect themselves." David Morgan continued working for the FBI, but he specialized in cases involving police corruption and crimes against children. His experience in Chicago made him one of the Bureau's most effective investigators in these areas. He helped other families get justice when local authorities failed them, using the skills he had developed during his 20-year quest for revenge. The 8-year-old boy who had watched his father die in a school parking lot had grown into a man who ensured that justice eventually prevailed. It had taken over 2 decades, but Detective Anthony Davis could finally rest in peace, knowing that his son had kept the promise he made that terrible night in February. The corrupt cops who thought they were untouchable learned that some debts can never be forgotten, and that justice, even when delayed, always finds a way to prevail.